The parking lot wasn't where anyone expected dignity. It was late afternoon, the hour when sunlight flattens everything into glare and shadow, when people are thinking about getting home, not about who's standing beside them. Cars moved in slow, impatient lines. Engines idled. Doors slammed. No one lingered longer than necessary. Anthony Hopkins had just finished a meeting nearby. Nothing remarkable. A conversation about schedules, about a project still in its earliest shape. He walked alone toward his car, coat draped over one arm, mind half occupied with lines he hadn't yet decided whether to accept. Then he saw him. The man sat on the curb near the far edge of the lot, slightly hunched, hands resting on his knees, as if holding himself together required constant effort. His clothes were clean but worn thin, washed too many times, patched too carefully. A cardboard sign lay face down beside him, as if even asking had grown tiring. Hopkins didn't stop immediately, not because he didn't care, but because he had learned, painfully, how easy it was to confuse impulse with understanding. He kept walking, eyes forward, until something pulled him back. The man looked up, not pleading, not expectant, just alert. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and in that second, Hopkins saw something he hadn't expected. Recognition, not of him, but of the world. The man wasn't lost. He wasn't drifting. He was here, fully present, bearing something heavy without advertisement. Hopkins slowed, then stopped. The sound of the lot continued around them. Tires on asphalt, a distant car alarm, voices echoing off concrete. But the space between the two men felt oddly quiet. "You all right?" Hopkins asked. The man studied him for a moment before answering. His voice, when it came, was steady but worn, like a well-used tool. "I'm managing," he said. Hopkins nodded. "That's not the same as all right." The man smiled faintly. "No, it isn't." Hopkins glanced down at the sign, still face down. "You don't like people reading it?" he asked. The man followed his gaze. "Sometimes I forget it's there." Hopkins considered that. "What's your name?" he asked. "Frank," the man replied after a pause. "Anthony," Hopkins said. Frank nodded politely, as if names were formalities rather than bridges. "You served," Hopkins said quietly. Frank's eyes flicked up, surprised, not offended. "Yes," he said. "A long time ago." "Vietnam," Hopkins added. Frank didn't ask how he knew. "Yeah," he said. "That's right." Hopkins exhaled slowly. He looked around the lot, not scanning for attention, not checking who might be watching, just orienting himself. "May I sit?" he asked. Frank hesitated. "You don't have to." "I know," Hopkins replied. That was enough. Hopkins set his coat aside and did something that caused two passing drivers to slow their cars without realizing why. He knelt. Not awkwardly. Not ceremonially. He lowered himself until his eyes were level with Frank's. The asphalt was rough against his knee. He didn't adjust. Frank stared at him, stunned, not by the gesture itself, but by how naturally it was done. "You really don't have to do that," Frank said quietly. "I do," Hopkins replied. "Otherwise I'll be talking down." Frank let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Most people don't even talk." Hopkins nodded. "I know." They sat like that for a moment. One man seated on the curb, the other kneeling beside him, neither in a hurry. "What happened?" Hopkins asked, not like an interviewer, not like a stranger collecting a story, but like someone prepared to hear a complicated answer. Frank leaned back slightly, eyes drifting toward a memory that had edges too sharp to touch directly. "Life," he said, "and then time." Hopkins smiled gently. "Time can be brutal." Frank glanced at him. "You don't look like it's been easy on you either." Hopkins chuckled softly. "It hasn't." Frank studied him more closely now. Not with recognition, but curiosity. "You famous?" Frank asked. "Sometimes," Hopkins said. Frank nodded. "That tracks." Hopkins raised an eyebrow. "Why's that?" "You're not trying to be impressive," Frank said. "People who need attention always are." Hopkins laughed quietly. "You might be right." A silence settled between them, comfortable, earned. "I didn't end up here overnight," Frank said eventually. "I didn't assume you did," Hopkins replied. Frank nodded, grateful. "They tell you when you come back," Frank continued, "that everything's going to make sense again, that you just have to keep moving." "And did it?" Hopkins asked. Frank shook his head. "No, it just got quieter." Hopkins felt that sentence land heavily. "What do you miss?" he asked. Frank didn't answer right away. "Being useful," he said finally. "Knowing where I belonged." Hopkins swallowed. "You still belong," he said. Frank smiled sadly. Belonging requires witnesses. Hopkins looked around the lot again, at the people passing by, at the way no one was really looking. I see you, he said. Frank's jaw tightened. That's dangerous to say, Frank replied. People say it, and keep walking. Hopkins didn't move. I'm not walking, he said. A car horn blared nearby. Someone shouted in irritation. Life continued its indifference. Frank glanced at Hopkins' knee, still on the asphalt. You know, Frank said quietly. People are staring. Hopkins shrugged. They'll survive. Frank laughed, surprised, and then stopped, emotion catching him off guard. You didn't have to kneel, he said again, softer this time. Hopkins met his eyes. I didn't kneel for you, he said. I knelt because I needed to remember something. Frank frowned. What's that? That dignity isn't something you give, Hopkins replied. It's something you recognize. Frank looked away, blinking. They sat in silence for a long moment. Eventually, Hopkins reached into his coat. Not quickly, not performatively, and pulled out his wallet. He didn't open it. Instead, he asked, Have you eaten today? Frank hesitated. Not really. Then let's fix that, Hopkins said. Frank looked up sharply. You don't have to. I know, Hopkins replied. But I want to. Frank exhaled slowly. All right. Hopkins stood, but before rising fully, he paused. Frank, he said. Yes. I'm going to stand up now, Hopkins said. But that doesn't mean this moment ends. Frank nodded. I understand. Hopkins rose, brushed the dust from his knee without concern, and picked up his coat. As they walked toward the small diner across the lot, people watched openly now. Phones came out. Whispers followed. Someone snapped a photo. Someone else recorded a few seconds of video, just long enough to capture what looked impossible to some eyes. A famous man kneeling beside a homeless veteran. But what no one could see yet, what the camera didn't catch, was the reason. And that reason hadn't been spoken aloud. Not yet. What happened inside that diner, what Frank would say, and what Hopkins would admit in return, would change both of them in ways the parking lot never could. But that part of the story hadn't unfolded yet. Not until they sat down at a small table by the window. Not until the noise of the world dimmed just enough for truth to surface. That was still to come. The diner smelled like old coffee and something fried too long ago. It was warm, though, and that mattered. Frank slid into the booth nearest the window out of habit, back to the wall, eyes tracking the room without looking obvious. Anthony noticed, said nothing, and took the seat across from him. A waitress approached, paused, then hesitated, recognition flickering across her face. She looked from Anthony to Frank, clearly unsure which rules applied. What can I get you? She asked finally, voice careful. 2 coffees, Anthony said. And whatever he'd like. Frank opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. Eggs, he said. If that's all right. Of course, she replied, already writing it down. She walked away, glancing back once. Silence settled. Not awkward, but waited. Outside, Anthony could see 2 people still standing near the edge of the parking lot, phones in their hands. One lifted theirs again, angling for a better shot through the glass. Frank followed his gaze. Looks like you've caused a situation, Frank said quietly. Anthony shrugged. It'll pass. It usually doesn't, Frank replied. It just mutates. Anthony studied him. You've had practice being watched. Frank gave a dry smile. You learn the difference between being seen and being observed. Anthony nodded. They're not the same. No, Frank said. One comes with curiosity. The other comes with distance. The coffee arrived. Anthony wrapped his hands around the mug, not drinking yet. You said you served, Anthony said gently. What did you do? Frank hesitated, then answered. Infantry. Most of us were. And after? Anthony asked. Frank laughed once, quietly. After, I tried to pretend that chapter ended cleanly. Anthony waited. It doesn't, Frank continued. It just stops being loud. You think that's better. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's worse. Anthony thought of his own silences. Different origins. Similar weight. What kept you going, he asked. Frank stared into his coffee. Habit, he said. And stubbornness. Anthony smiled faintly. Those are underrated skills. Frank glanced up. You talk like someone who's lost things. Anthony met his eyes. I have. Frank nodded once, satisfied. Then you know why people like me don't like being pitted. I do, Anthony said. Pity flattens people. Frank relaxed slightly at that. The food arrived. Frank ate slowly at first, then with more certainty, as if his body needed a moment to remember it was allowed to be fed. You didn't answer my earlier question, Frank said between bites. Which one? Anthony asked. Why you really stopped? Anthony looked out the window again. The small group had grown. Someone was talking animatedly into their phone now. I've spent a long time being listened to, Anthony said. Being quoted. Being applauded. Frank smiled. They walked back toward the curb where Frank had been sitting earlier. Frank stopped. This is me, he said. Anthony nodded. He reached into his coat again. Not his wallet this time, but a small card. There's a veterans center a few blocks from here, Anthony said. They run programs that don't rush people. No paperwork ambushes. No speeches. Frank eyed the card. You carry these around? Anthony smiled. Only since today. Frank took it carefully. I'm not promising anything, he said. I wouldn't want you to, Anthony replied. Just options. Frank folded the card and slipped it into his jacket pocket. They stood there, unsure how to end something that hadn't felt like a beginning or a goodbye. You know, Frank said, people are going to turn this into a story. Anthony nodded. They already have. They'll say you saved me, Frank added. Anthony shook his head immediately. Correct them if you can. Frank smiled. I will. And what will you say instead? Anthony asked. That you sat down, Frank said, and didn't rush me. Anthony felt that settle somewhere deep. That's enough, Frank continued. For one day. They shook hands, not tightly, not ceremonially. Just two men acknowledging each other. Anthony turned toward his car. After a few steps, Frank called out, Anthony. He turned back. Next time you hear someone like me, Frank said, don't assume we want to be lifted. Anthony nodded. Understood. Frank smiled. Just make room. Anthony got into his car and drove away slowly. By the time he reached home, the video was everywhere. Headlines stripped the moment of context. Captions guessed at motives. Comment sections argued over sincerity. Anthony didn't watch any of it. Later that night, he received a single text from an unknown number. I went to the center. Just talked. No promises. Anthony stared at the screen for a long moment, then replied. That's more than enough. He put the phone down. The internet would move on in a day or two. It always did. But somewhere, a man who had learned to survive without witnesses had been seen, not as a symbol, not as a cause, but as himself. And another man, long accustomed to standing above rooms, had knelt, not to be smaller, but to be accurate. That was the reason it mattered. Not because it was filmed, not because it went viral, but because, for once, dignity wasn't performed. It was shared, and nothing online would ever fully capture that.